Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the webinar, Queer Justice at School, a Pride Month conversation on the new book just published by Teachers College Press titled, you guessed it, Queer Justice at School, a guide for youth activists, allies, and their teachers, which was just released this spring. That's our agenda this afternoon. I hope everyone's in the right place. First of all, on behalf of the publisher, TC Press, Teachers College Press, let me introduce myself. My name is Emily, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. I'm just going to be going over some brief introductory comments and housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over to our panel straight away for the conversation. The book we're here to examine this afternoon is, of course, Queer Justice at School, as I said. It is, in short, a youth-friendly guide for building more just and liberatory school communities. We know that change is needed to make schools more inclusive of gender and sexual diversity. This book is for secondary students grades 6 to 12 and their adult allies who are working towards that end. It's an accessible book. It's written in a way that is appropriate for students and adults working together in contexts like GSAs. It discusses related forms of injustice, including racism, white supremacy, ableism, colonialism, and classism. It's really just an invaluable resource for building community and working in coalition to address the diverse needs of LGBTQ plus young people in schools. Why am I telling you this? Surely our panel is going to spend an hour exploring the book's ideas. And that's true, but I wanted to take the opportunity to call your attention to how valuable the resource is and how useful it will be to anyone doing this work. It's perfect for teachers, youth organizers, students, community activists, librarians, teacher educators, really any and all stakeholders invested in bringing about queer justice in their schools and communities. It's also exclusively for those of you here today on sale. We're offering a 20% discount on the book to everyone who is registered for this webinar. When I'm through here speaking in a moment, I'll put the details of that discount in the chat. So look out for that. And I really urge you to take advantage of it and, get this resource in the places it can do the most good. So we are thrilled to have with us this afternoon, who else but the author of the book, to take us through the research and the ideas behind the book. Please welcome Elizabeth J. Meyer, who is a professor and program chair in educational foundations, policy, and practice at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Meyer is also a former high school teacher and the author of a prior book with Teachers College Press, Gender, Bullying, and Harassment, Strategies to End Sexism and Homophobia in Schools from 2009. Welcome, Elizabeth Meyer. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for taking the time to collaborate with us on this program this afternoon. She is joined by our two esteemed panelists. Our thanks also go out to them for being here and sharing their insights and expertise. First, we have Rebecca Kaplan, who is a public school librarian and GSA sponsor. She has led professional development for educators. She leads book clubs for educators and students and is passionate specifically about queer young adult fiction. She's also a researcher with a doctorate in learning sciences and a participant in Dr. Meyer's study that led to the book. Secondly, please welcome Dr. Lee Ayrton, who is an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies in education at Queen's University, Ontario. Thank you to all three of you for being here this afternoon to discuss the book with us. Final words from me. Questions, we're reserving some time at the end for a Q&A, so please put those in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so drop your questions as you think of them, and time permitting, we'll return to those a little later. Next, look out for a follow-up email from us in the next few business days. We'll be sharing the recording of today's webinar. That is yours to reference and use as long as you find it valuable. Feel free to share it with any colleagues who aren't here who you think may benefit from today's conversation. These webinars are free resources we offer in support of our publishing program, which I urge you all to check out. You can find prior webinars on our YouTube channel. You can visit our website, tcpress.com. We have resources for educators and teacher educators on LGBTQ plus students, multicultural, social justice education, leadership. Please check us out, explore our books, follow us on social, subscribe to our newsletters. Just get in touch and tell us what resources would be useful to you in your role. We'd love to hear from you. You can find all this at our website, tcpress.com. So that's it for me. Without further ado, let's dive in. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Meyer.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate you setting this up and giving us time together to chat today, because we really want this to be a fun dialogue that introduces you to some of the ideas presented in the book, but kind of inviting you into our little friendly circle, because I was fortunate enough to invite some of my favorite people to be part of this conversation. So I'm going to expand on the introductions a little bit to just let you know why I'm so excited to be in conversation with these folks. So Dr. Lee Ayrton and I met first when Lee was a little undergrad at McGill University, and I was a little doctoral student teaching a multicultural ed class. And it just shows how much we have to learn from our students, because since day one that I met Lee. They've been asking great questions, bringing in new materials, like having great conversations. And I am just so honored and excited to continue to be a colleague and a friend and be now sharing this discipline with Lee. So thank you so much for being here today, Lee.
Uh, my pleasure. I'll say more about you in a minute.
And then our second panelist is another dear friend and colleague, Dr. Becca Kaplan, one of the first doctoral students I was ever on a committee for. So I have learned so much alongside you as well. And the fact that you came through our PhD program at CU Boulder and went back into the classroom and have been back in high secondary schools as a librarian. Your day-to-day practice with educators and your leadership and policy and change in both rural and urban districts and your work with youth engaged change is so inspiring to me. And so that's another reason why I wanted you to be here today to help share what you have to say about the book, because I love all of our conversations too, Becca.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Yeah, of course. So the basic plan for today, I'm going to start off with a little story about kind of how I came to write this book, the sort of why this book, why now? And then I'm going to introduce a little bit of chapter one and then a conversation for the panelists to have about youth-led change. Then I'm going to pass the mic on to Lee, and Lee is going to lead us through a conversation around two other chapters. Chapter two, Making Your Case, which is about data-based decision-making and how to use evidence. And chapter 7 on busting binaries, which is really understanding the experiences and supporting trans and non-binary youth in schools. And then after that conversation led by Lee, we'll shift over to Becca, who's going to focus on chapter 3, queering learning and classrooms, and have a conversation around those topics. And then I'm going to end with a little bit of highlights from chapter 8, which is strategies for action, and sharing a little bit about the companion website. And then we're holding about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A with you all, which Emily will come back and help moderate. So we hope this will meet your needs today. So for me, I'd really just like to answer this question. Why did I write this book? Because honestly, I was on sabbatical in 2021 and I was supposed to write another book then, and it just didn't want to come out. And then as I was doing the research project that led to this book came out, and I was like, this is the book I need to be writing. And so basically it started when I was a classroom teacher in 1993 in rural upstate New York, and had recently come out to myself and was feeling some friction and challenges in the school community. And one of my students was also going through her own coming out journey, and I was trying to figure out how to support her. And I got connected with what is now known as GLSEN, but at the time it was called the Gay, Lesbian, Independent School Teachers Network. And I went to one of their workshops in Boston in 1994, and that really kind of empowered me. And it led me to speak out and try to lead some change at that school, which led to my immediate dismissal, pretty much. And so that was my first encounter with like real direct homophobia in schools towards educators and young people. And so that motivated me to become more involved in LGBTQ activism. I moved to New York City. I became a lesbian avenger doing grassroots street level activism, and then applied to graduate school because I knew I wanted to stay in education. So I came to CU Boulder, got my master's in educational foundations, and went back to teaching for a couple more years at a school in rural New Hampshire. And I was there for 3 more years. And then I started up a local chapter of GLSEN. And we had our first GSA prom in the state of New Hampshire in 2001. We had our first coming out day rally where we had student speakers on the State House steps in Concord, New Hampshire. And I was really feeling excited about the momentum. And then I went on a Fulbright because as a French teacher, I had the opportunity to go teach English at a school in France. And shortly after arriving in France, I got notified from my school that they would not be renewing my contract and I would not be allowed to return, mostly related to my activism around LGBTQ topics. So I decided if I wanted to keep doing this work, I needed to find another path. So I applied to get my PhD. I went to McGill University in Montreal, and now I found my way back to the faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I started as the Associate Dean of Teacher Education. And I was in that role from 2015 to 2018 during the first Trump administration. And in that role, I was struggling with what was happening in the classrooms where our student teachers were being placed and what our practicing teachers and our teacher coaches were talking about, the hate speech that were coming up and the friction that was coming up around the rhetoric that was coming out of the Trump campaign. So I started doing a research project on free speech and what we called the Trump effect in schools. And I found two stories from different educators who had been reprimanded for leading advocacy projects with their students around LGBTQ equity. And that's what really raised this question of what is the experience of educators who are focused and courageous and committed enough to actually want to design and lead advocacy and activism projects for LGBTQ equity in their schools. So I designed a research project focused on educators in Colorado. And I did in-depth interviews with 7 different educators across the state, middle and high school teachers, counselors, librarians, classroom teachers. And through that, I learned a lot of what they needed, what they didn't have, what they didn't know. And so this book actually isn't about what the study was focused on. It's not the book that about my participants, but it's a book I wrote for my participants. And so there's other research coming out from the study that's in articles under review right now. But this book is what I wrote because I wanted it to be in the hands of those youth clubs, of those educators who are doing this work right now. So that's what led me to write this book here and now. And that's why I really wanted to write it so it could be read alongside youth in a GSA club or in an after school program. I wrote it so it would be hopefully accessible to middle and high school readers as well as their teachers and family members, because I really did want to empower youth-led change. And so that's why the first chapter is called Youth Making Change. And I provide a little bit of a brief history of LGBTQ youth equity-led projects starting in the 70s, coming up until present day. And so that's the first question I want to invite our panel to talk a little bit about. Like, what is your experience with youth-led change, and what lessons have you taken from it that you would like to share with the folks in the room? And I will ask Rebecca, if you don't mind, starting first.
Sure. Thanks so much, Liz. So I was thinking a little bit about before the webinar started, we were chatting and you mentioned something from long ago for Lee. And I was thinking about youth change when I was a young person myself. So when I was in high school, I had this is such a well-resourced and privileged thing to have, but there was an option for seniors to take off like weeks of school, I think 2 weeks of school, to pursue some kind of project. And I took off weeks of school and went to all the different schools, high schools in my district. I was in Jefferson County, and talked about doing what I really wanted was I wanted to do a conference that was for students who didn't normally get chosen for conferences. So I had gotten to like go to the Hugh O'Brien Youth Leadership conference, and it had been super meaningful to me. And I had gotten a couple of other things like that because I was one of those students in school that got chosen for things like that. And I felt like it was very clear that there were the same students are getting those opportunities over and over again. And they're super moving and life-changing, and especially for queer youth, when you go to something in your state and you're pulling students from all across the state, you really get to see a different cross-section of students. You get to feel more connected to a larger community. And so I ended up having this, we called it the Negate the Hate Youth Conference, which I think you can tell is very, is a youthful name. But it was, I got to kind of pull together some of the speakers and activities from the different conferences I had attended, and then ask the counselors from each high school to send people who wouldn't normally get chosen for that. And we got to have this amazing conference, but I also got to kind of have this little bit of coalition building for myself of pulling those speakers from the different spaces and learning more about what they did and kind of working with them as their colleague, even though I was a young person. So just brought back an old memory I haven't thought about in a long time. But just thinking about now, looking back at my career, getting to do that kind of work as an educator and support young people in doing making change and pursuing their ideas and their solutions that are always going to be different than what adults are choosing to do to support young people, getting that kind of youthful look and eye on what it is that they want to change and what their solutions are is so different. And I do have an example I want to share, but I'll share it later. But and more broadly, just working with GSAs in middle school and high school, and youth participatory action research projects with students and teachers has been a big part of my career.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Becca. How about Julie? What would you like to share?
I would love to just say something really quick about the experiences that I've had supporting Kingston Youth Pride. I live in Kingston, Ontario. I'm a professor at Queen's, and we've had many iterations of really robust high school student organizing. And what I will say is that when I first came here, a lot of that organizing was happening among queer trans students under the banner of their gender or sexuality. But I'm now able to participate in some of the school board youth-led initiatives that are just organized under the banner of leadership, but they're all queer. So at least in my context, I'm really noticing that a lot of the folks who are stepping up to take leadership in schools are queer and trans students who are very strongly allied, and I find that really incredible. And another thing I get to do is I get to work a lot with queer and trans teacher candidates, and all of these queer and trans young people, what I love about being led by their needs and their questions and doing things together is that they aren't yet socialized into our institutions. So when they have a real question about like, oh, can we do that? And someone says no, they want to know why, and they're not satisfied with the answer because they haven't been working there for 10, 20, 15, 20 years. And they don't realize that, oh, we don't do that here. Well, why? And then people like me or teachers on our board have to go back and find the answer. And so I think that's one of my favorite things about youth-led change is that there aren't these blinders on about what is possible, because simply so many of our rules and our habits just don't actually make sense when we turn our minds to them and think about changing them. I'd like to say to my students that a rule is just is someone sitting in an office saying whether something's okay or not. So just find who they are and talk to them, and they go, they go and they chat, and then we make things happen. So that's what I'd contribute about that.
That's awesome. Thank you both so much for getting that conversation started. And that's actually my first little intro segue, and I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Ayrton to choose the topics that you wanted to focus on for this panel.
Totally. So my brief is to talk a little bit from chapter 2 and chapter 7. But before I do that, I just wanted to give Liz her flowers. I don't know if we can't see you, but I wanted to invite you to do this because I think this book is, as you can tell, I think from the emotion that you shared with us when you were describing your journey to this book, I think it's the book that you've been carrying in your heart for a really long time. And I think it's the book that you wish you wanted someone to have written when you were a teacher and you were having that horrible experience. So I think it's, especially in these horrible times, I think that it's just such a wonderful full circle moment for you to be giving the book to the people who are you in some of those situations and who are facing, being fired and wanting to do these things and worrying about their job. So I think it's the book you've been carrying with you for a very long time. And I'm so proud of the work you've done and what it is. And I want everyone out there to know that Liz brings people with her. Liz is a fantastic senior mentor, and I don't mean that in an age way. Ever since I met you, you have been mentoring me, and you can take credit for whatever success I'm able to have. So thank you, and I'm honored to be on your panel today. So yeah, my brief is to chat about chapter 2. Chapter 2 is where Liz breaks down all of the research that we have. I'm going to say it's a lot of American research, but that's fine. It's an American book. You are also American. You live in America now. Hooray. But of course, us up in Canada, we know that we've had maybe 2 cross-Canada studies that get anywhere near the breadth that the GLSEN studies have had. So we use that all the time. We cite it all over our own stuff. So that's fantastic. Liz walks the reader through the kind of the latest research on the experiences of LGBTQ+ students, which are pretty terrible. We all know that. But not only, Liz also is really, I like a lot how you walk beside the reader and you say, you actually warn the reader that you're going to be getting into it before you do, and you kind of alert them to the problem that we have as a field with largely generating bad findings, like not bad quality, but like sad, awful stories of their lives. And I really think that you show a lot of care for your reader in saying, like, this is coming up, this is what's going on, and this is what I'm about to share with you. And you also offer us a lot of literature on the supports that queer and trans students are accessing in schools. One thing that I really think will appeal to a lot of teachers in particular are the ideas to share with students about creating data in your own school. So Liz talks about mapping projects, having art shows, how you can organize a local climate survey as a way to make change. And I think the message that I take away from the chapter is how important it is to connect students' experiences with wider findings, because it should motivate people to take action when we figure out that something's wrong here. But often the people who are in power need what's wrong here to be connected to what's wrong elsewhere. Because I think, especially in our topic, when I share data with folks who work in schools, especially at senior levels, they want to know that they're not worse. They want to know that they're not uniquely bad. And I don't mean them personally, I mean the data that we have about the school. And often it is very important to be able to show that 65% of our students say this, but actually in this larger study, only 50% of students said that. So we actually have a significantly larger problem. And that kind of makes me want to barf, because we shouldn't have to do that. But I think a lot of activism is knowing you shouldn't have to do something and then doing it because you have an outcome in mind. So with that, I just was wondering about that care for your reader, because it's really challenging to walk that line between being honest about what we actually know and also exercising care. I think especially when we're in a position of supporting a young person who wants to make change. Like, we know the stats, if we're researchers or research informed in our practice, we know the structures, and we want to take care of them and not have them encounter those things badly, and yet encountering them as part of activism. So that's something I was hoping to ask you two for your thoughts about, walking that line. Yeah.
I guess I can start. And that's, one of the things that I remember, especially with all the book bans and stuff coming up, like if young people are old enough to live these experiences, then we're old enough to understand and talk about them, whether it be racism, whether it be homophobia, whether it be transphobia. We know young people in our schools every day are living with the very real harms and challenges caused by the toxic environments that are well documented in these studies. And so I do feel like I did want to sort of elevate the issue of this sort of risk-based narrative that a lot of scholars have rightfully critiqued. And also looking a little bit at the history and the story of how we came to rely on these risk-based narratives as an important rhetorical strategy to get as many people on board to understand that we have some real tangible harms that have to be addressed if we want our young people to not only thrive in school, but just to survive, right? And so, yeah, that's why I wanted to include information about available resources and supports, and to, let young people who are living that difficulty to just skip to the next section. You don't need to read the percentages and the stats right now if you're living it, right? So that was kind of my thinking about that, but then also wanting to talk about the wonderful research that shows the impact of a positive affirming environment. And I've really wanted to kind of end the chapter on that note of really emphasizing the positive impacts of supportive and inclusive environments and what those data have to tell us of how far we have to go yet. But I would love also to hear what your thoughts are on this, Becca.
I think it's so wonderful because I think the book is so accessible. Like, I really do think that high school students and middle school students could read this book with guidance, with support, and take so much out of it and be so energized by it. And I love that there's this kind of care for, maybe you are not the audience for this part. Maybe this part is for our teacher educators, our researchers, our teachers. And you don't have to read this part. And I think the chapters really can stand on their own. Like, it could be that we absolutely pull a chapter out, or focus on just one at a time. But I think that also I'm thinking about there's a wonderful exhibit about Maurice Sendak at the Denver Art Museum. And I was just thinking about Maurice Sendak, our fabulous queer illustrator and author, and there was a quote that was something about just children can handle the real dangers and scary parts of life, and being able to face it is something that they're like naturally able to do, or something along those lines. It was a beautiful quote that I'm not doing a good job with, but it was it kind of makes me think of that. Just that I also think the majority of young people that I work with and have worked with would want to read that chapter and would want to be kind of armed with the knowledge to be able to advocate and explain to their families, to their schools, to their districts, to their school boards, why the work is so important. So I think both. They could skip it, or they probably would want to read it.
I love that. Thanks, Becca. I think something else that was sitting with me when I was rereading the chapter was the idea that we have all of this wonderful research, and part of the great struggle that right now in doing this work is knowing that even in Canada, Alberta and Saskatchewan, laws have completely disregarded the research. It's a tough thing to know. So I think giving young people and the folks who are supporting them the local, like a localized strategy to connect with local folks, like local policymakers, local administrators. I think the local is really where we're going to see that kind of resistance. And I think your book beautifully sets people up for that work, Liz. Amazing. Do you want me to do my second nugget? Okay, wicked. Yeah, so my second brief here was to give a little bit of pizzazz to chapter 7, and chapter 7 is called Busting Binaries. And in this chapter, Liz, what I really like, I'm not just like sorry, I'm trying to say appropriate things. I'm not just like blowing smoke in your butt. Like, is that appropriate? Because I was gonna say it was way less appropriate. I'll just say that. Also, Beck, I didn't know Maurice Sendak was queer, but Where the Wild Things Are was Max was my gender avatar. So like I live in a box and I don't know things, but that completely makes sense. Like that's and I was a very well behaved child, so I don't know why I thought he was like me, but anyway. There's no wild rumpus anyway. So yeah, I do genuinely love how Liz begins the Busting the Binaries chapter by talking about cis heteropatriarchy and where it comes from, like its roots in enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade, for example, and really in a way that brings together, I think, a lot of people who are affected by this structure of power, including trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people. But just like the rest of the book, I think you ground the unique issues that trans students face in schools in that context, which is a great way of saying it's not like a unique trans problem. This is a larger structure that messes with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and I think that's really important. Folks will find a lot of actionable, practical suggestions about names and pronouns and gym and bathrooms and locker rooms and athletics, and there's a whole wonderful section about non-binary students as well, when so many equity frameworks in schools just really struggle to get out of that. And I want to say that I think we as fancy scholars can really get upset about accommodations and an accommodations framework, and having that be the focus of activism is getting accommodation or getting access to accommodation. And I, as a fancy scholar, can really feel sad about that and how that's an individualizing, non-transformative approach. But at the end of the day, people have to have better lives in school. So I really appreciate how you do focus us there, and you hold your nose and you offer a gender support plan template, because that is an accommodation approach. But like, while we wait for the world to change, we need to be better. So I guess I have a sad question. It's so hard to write a book like this, and I know from my own experience when so much is changing so quickly. Like, it's no longer easier to get a gender on your passport and then on your birth certificate. So I guess just like how do we cope as people who make stuff? And I know we have some scholars and some authors with us today, and putting things out when stuff changes so fast and we're on such shaky ground. Like, what's your experience or your reflection on that? I mean, I imagine it's awesome.
No, it's definitely not awesome, because of course, like the minute the book is like, published and in press, and then like Trump is president again, I'm like reading proofs and I'm like talking about the Trump presidency and having to write first Trump presidency. And I'm like, no, why am I having to write this?
I refuse to do that.
But actually, one of the things I did that I'm going to talk about at the end is I decided to create this companion website. So there would be real-time updates and access to information that can supplement what is in the book that can't be changed, but can give readers access to more updated, more current information that reflects what's happening right now. That's also why I blog. I blog for Psychology Today, and I try to write, things that are responsive to the moment, and those are also linked on the website. And so it is a challenge for us when we put something in print, right? And we know it's somewhat static for a significant period of time. Like, what can we do to make sure it stays alive, stays responsive, stays relevant? And those are some things I've had to do. But I also rely very much on the adult allies and the educators working with the book to take it, right? To take what is useful. It always makes me think of like the bell hooks quote about working with Frary. If you're thirsty, you don't care that your water has some rocks in it, right? You drink the water and you spit out the rocks. Yes, drink the water, spit out the rocks. And so that's kind of the same thing. Like, if there's things that you're reading in this book that are not right for your context or don't seem relevant or appropriate, drink the water, but spit out the rocks. Come to the website, talk to your colleagues, talk to your local experts, and find out how you can readapt and update and make it relevant to your current context. And I know Becca does that a lot in your work. So I would love it if you could also say kind of what your experiences is with Lee's question.
Well, I love that there are moments where you really acknowledge that that we're all in different contexts, and that there are states. Liz talks about how Colorado passed not that long ago an update to our social studies standards that says that we must include the voices, minoritized voices, and specifically names LGBT voices and histories, and that California has similar laws, and many states do. And but Liz also mentions that there are many places in our country where we have explicit laws that say you can't, right? The Don't Say Gay laws say that you can't bring in any kind of explicit mention of LGBT identities. And so I like the way that you help the reader understand that contexts are different and that matters, and that there's also always something that can be done. And I feel like there's a moment where you talk about the even if you have Don't Say Gay laws, you can still have students question whose voices are missing. What are we not understanding when we read this part of our textbook, or what are we missing when we read this account? And a lot of other suggestions like that lead us to think critically, open our minds, think about our curriculum without without explicitly going against the policy. Knowing that we just have these different contexts. And then, yeah, I will say, like, the companion website is awesome. It's super, super helpful. It's one of those things where I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to bookmark everything. Like, right, like I will come back to that a lot, and I'll come back to this book a lot. Absolutely, like, teachers need this book, and I primarily work with teachers and students. They need the book, and that website is wonderful. And I use your Psychology Today blog all the time because they're these little tiny nuggets. They're really short, and they're great for people to kind of gain access to some of the world of research, but in a really approachable, bite-sized way. And so I'm just thinking about, there are so many things that you do to keep it alive, even though the printed word then gets kind of stuck in time. So I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I think that's the end of Lee's plan section for the panel. Thank you so much. That was a great conversation. And now I'd like to pass the mic over to Becca to take up the chapter and the questions that you wanted to discuss.
Wonderful. So I think I will start as well with just talking a little bit about Liz. So the chapter I'm going to talk about is chapter 3. And chapter 3 is called Queering Learning in Classrooms. And it starts with a bit of a kind of primer on queer theory, and which is very digestible for non-academics, but also great for academics as reminders, and really, really conjures all kinds of wonderful texts and quotes and thoughts about queer theory. And I was thinking about how Liz really queers the relationship between teacher and student, and also the relationship between researcher and participant in her work. And I've gotten to be a part of that queering relationship in multiple different ways. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So I'm one of the participants, one of the GSA sponsors and librarians who worked with Liz in the study that was kind of the background of this book. And that was also the recipients of the book, right? And one of the things that's just so amazing about Liz is that when we entered into that participant relationship of like, I'm going to do these long form interviews with you, she also said, it's a two-way relationship, and I want to be able to support your district and your school. And so you can choose, like, what are ways that I can support you all, whether it's coming and doing professional development, whether it's coming and giving a talk, consulting. And that's just something that she, I think, always offers, which is incredible, and that I've really taken her up on. I think that I can't even begin to say how much Liz has helped me navigate the different things that have come up doing advocacy work and working to support LGBT youth in schools. She's the first person I'll go to if I'm like, oh, there's a new thing that's happening. There's a new parent group that's trying to shut down our inclusive policies, or there's a new interest in banning a book or whatever. I feel like she's always the person to go to with information about policy specifically and best practices and research. So it's just really wonderful. I'm so happy to get to work with you. And I think that there's just a lot to take from that queering relationship that is really beautiful, that really fits with chapter 3 in the book. So more about chapter 3. So I love this because there are specific activities that Liz outlines. There's an activity on like binaries and really starting to name binaries that might be invisible in society, that aren't invisible at all, but that we can create visibility around and start to think about binaries and how they are running our society. She talks about, like I already said, the laws that are impacting different states, US centric in that part, but really, really helpful for those of us who are navigating those. She talks about then all of the different core content areas and how you could queer curriculum in each of those. So social studies is kind of the content area that most often is going to be updated in the law, like it is in California and Colorado, and she gives examples of commonly taught social studies lessons that can be expanded to include LGBT identities and history, which is just great. Like, it's such a quick, helpful way to say, here's what we're talking about to teachers. I feel like there's a lot for teachers in this chapter. She talks about 4 ways of queering language arts, which is really helpful because it's not just including LGBT books, but that is one of the 4 ways that she talks about using queer texts. And excuse me. And as a librarian, I'm just going to give a book recommendation for queering texts. I love using Every Day by David Levithan, which is a book about a character who wakes up in a different body every day. It's a queer author. There's a lot of queerness in the actual text, but I think that the discussion you can have with readers can lead to really a deep understanding of queer theory and kind of surfacing those binaries. So I've read it with a teacher book club and talked about, the entire book. Like, the main character doesn't have any kind of identity of their own, right? They're just waking up in other people's identities and bodies. But when adults talk about the character, and probably young people too, they're using he, him pronouns. They're assuming that he's straight and white, and there's we don't have any of that information. So it's a really nice way to surface what are the assumptions and what are the binaries that are just kind of already operating in our brains, and what would it take, and how can we push back on that? And if we can push back on that, what are the additional possibilities that come to the surface when reading and when thinking about the character A? So language arts, wonderful. She has these other ways of explicitly queering language arts. I highly recommend reading this chapter. and talks about specific ways to queer math and science and gives examples of different lessons that different scholars and educators have already put together, which is really helpful. There's a place in the science chapter. Yes. Where, do you want to talk about that really quick?
Me or Liz?
Well, I was just going to say, I pulled a lot of them from this wonderful edited collection that Dr. Lee Ayrton is one of the major organizers. And so I did use a lot of the guides that I present in the book as condensed from what was shared here, because these were such wonderful lessons. So Lee, would you like to just pipe in for a minute about that book?
Briefly, it is, as far as I know at the time, a couple of years ago, the only edited collection of lesson plans that teachers have actually taught about gender diversity in all K-12 subjects and areas. So it's out there, it's great. It's called Teaching About Gender Diversity. A lot of awesome people in that book, and I edited it with Susan Woolley. Thanks for the shout out. Mwah.
I love that. Thank you for saying it. I'm looking for this quote that I really want to read, but I'm not finding it. So I'll keep going. Yeah, just lots of examples of lessons, lots of ways. Liz is pointing us to different resources that are on the companion website and helping us see that no matter what content you're teaching, there are ways to queer your content. And it's just so lovely. Specific lesson ideas from Kumashiro on embryonic development, which I feel like Kevin Kumashiro shows up so much in this book and has a blurb on the back, and just wonderful, wonderful ways that Liz is pointing to Kevin's work. And it's just awesome. There's a whole part about same-sex coupling in the natural world, and that's just a wonderful part too. As a librarian, there's lots of book recommendations in this section that Liz is giving that are just all wonderful books that I see on our shelves and that I've put on our shelves. And I wanted to give a little book recommendation from this section too, from the science section and sexuality and health education. Liz wrote, in lessons about relationships, sexuality, and bodies, it's important to talk expansively to ensure accurate and inclusive information is available to students of all genders and sexualities about puberty, reproduction, and safer sex practices. And I just wanted to give a book recommendation for our early childhood folks in the room. And I know I've seen some people have put this in the chat. So I love the book. It's called What Makes a Baby, and it's by Corey Silverberg. And I'm trying to see, I wrote it down, and illustrated by Fiona Smith. What Makes a Baby is a children's book. I've been reading it to my 3-year-olds since they were tiny, and it just ensures this inclusive, accurate language around reproduction, which is really so much more expansive than the stories that we mostly tell littles. So I really appreciate that lovely book. And that team also has similar books about puberty and about sexuality and sex and gender that go up into younger elementary and middle school that are also wonderful that I've used with students. So,
and that's also from a Canadian team, right? Corey Silverberg is a Canadian sex educator. So lots of good stuff from our Canadian friend.
Awesome. I want to stop soon because I want us to get into the conversation, but just one other thing that Liz does in this chapter that's so wonderful. She talks about flag stickers and other displays and how visibility matters. And she does this debunking of the 4 main arguments against kind of these visibility features. And it's so good and so helpful, really wonderful for teachers, really wonderful for conversations with parents, conversations with students about why these things matter. And I just wanted to say, like, as an educator and someone who has tons of resources and community that I'm going into a new school with, it still matters to me if I see a rainbow flag on someone's door, or if I see a safe, like a safe classroom sign. I mean, there are ways that these are bat signals to me that that's going to be someone I can be safe with and work with. And that is even as an adult. And so the thought of like that, the thought that this stuff doesn't matter is just so ludicrous. It matters so much. It matters to all of our young people. It matters to our young people who are rolling their eyes about rainbows. That's fine. They can roll their eyes. They're still happy to see that somebody put a bat signal up that says you can talk to me and you can be yourself around me and you can talk about your family, your moms, your anything, and it's going to be okay. I think these symbols matter so much, and so I like how Liz debunks those different myths. And she also has a Psychology Today blog that does the same thing. That's very, very helpful to use. So bring those to your ed classrooms or practitioner rooms. And yeah, thank you. I love this resource. I'm going to use it all the time, Liz.
Thank you so much, Becca. And yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about chapter 8 and a little bit more about the website, but we got about 15 minutes left and we thought it would be more enjoyable to interact with you all. So I know there's been some stuff going in the chat. It's been a little bit hard for me to track, but I'm going to invite Emily to come back and help us moderate and maybe elevate one or two of the questions from the chat that have emerged, and then we can start the conversation there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive right in. Lots of wonderful things coming up in the chat. Thank you everyone for your attention and thoughts. We received some questions from our participant Warren about trans people in particular and how they're under attack by the Trump administration. And I know we spoke about this a little bit earlier in terms of the kind of precarious political situation. But this question specifically for Lee was asking, what has Canada done right that you would suggest in the US? And I want to open that up a little bit more if anyone has thoughts about it. What has been right in your classroom, schools, districts? Is there positive examples you can point to of how people are weathering the current political moment?
Liz, do you want to just plug our special issue and then I'll say something about Canada?
Yeah, I'll just start by saying Lee and I are co-editing a special issue of the Journal of Queer and Trans Studies in Education about resistance and advocacy and activism work that's going on around the world right now. I mean, mostly US and Canadian submissions that we're reviewing, and we're hoping to have the journal out by early 2026. But we are really excited to share some of these really amazing stories of educators, scholars, young people working together to create change in their communities. And so that will hopefully be something you can refer to and draw from. But yes, I want Lee to address more specifically what's going on in Canada. And it's not all going well in Canada.
No, it's not. I'm not here to tell you a good story. I mean, well, I think to Warren's question, what has gone well in Canada is the fact that our human rights protections, our anti-discrimination protections, are actually in a federal law. They're not a function of an executive order directing people in schools to interpret sex discrimination in a particular way, which can be so easily rescinded. It's about the fact that gender identity and gender expression are in our charter. So that is extremely useful because it means, on the surface, it means that it's not sort of subject to the same kinds of political whims. However, to keep Quebec in our confederation, which is a very, very basic way of saying it, we included a notwithstanding clause in our Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms that a province could legislate notwithstanding the charter, so they could ignore those human rights for a period of 5 years before a law has to be reviewed. So that's why we have legislated discrimination against trans young people in Saskatchewan and Alberta, because they bypassed our charter. So we have a lot of problems that are caused by compromise, legislative compromise, and but I would say that what we did have was a sense of stability, because no one thought anyone would use it, the notwithstanding clause. That was a huge surprise to us all, but we have had a significant constitutional bedrock upon which to do a lot of institutional and structural change in education that I think is really bearing fruit even in those provinces today. And it was not a sense of a new election brings a revocation of an executive order, because we had that legislative change at the federal level. I think that's something we did well. And it was a tripartisan bill that did that. Conservatives, our leftist party, and our centrist party. It's pretty cool.
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts on this from any of the panelists? We can move on. This question, I think I'm going to direct to Becca, but anyone feel free to jump in with your thoughts. We received 2 questions from an attendee, Bobby, earlier. I'll go ahead and read them both. What, if any, research exists regarding access to LGBTQ+ literature in independent schools? And second, what, if any, scholarship exists to show the benefit of LGBTQ plus literature for non-LGBTQ plus people? So I'm curious about your thoughts about this, Becca, as a school librarian, but anyone who has a reaction to those questions, please feel free to weigh in.
So Liz does a great job of overviewing the research in the book. And so I feel like the book is a great starting point for kind of where do I look? What are other books that are going to cover reading the rainbow, or what are other research studies they're going to cover why it's important to have that visibility and inclusion in your library and in the books that you're reading in your curriculum. So I feel like I want to move it to Liz for that, and then maybe I can talk a little bit more about books after you kind of explain the parts of the research that you included already.
Yeah, and I do want to answer like the first point of the question that, that there's very few studies that I'm aware of that have focused specifically on independent schools. Most research I'm familiar with really does focus on the public school setting. And so I'm glad to see that you are diving into this for your dissertation, because the context in independent schools is understudied, because it's hard to extrapolate from one to another, because they're not subject to the same curriculum requirements, the same kind of state legislative, expectations for teaching and learning, and those kinds of things. So from school to school, depending on their resources, depending on if it's a religious private school or an otherwise non-religious, and the variations from school to school are quite different. And so it's a little bit harder to generalize, I guess, findings if you're focusing on a single independent school environment. So there's not as much that I'm aware of. But in terms of the research, I mean, I'm not a literacy researcher, but I know that one of my master's students this spring did really fascinating capstone project on the importance of representation. And this one was focusing on particularly Black girls. But there is a lot of interesting research that really shows the importance and value of representation in literature selection. And that's something I know Becca can talk to more effectively than I can, because you've done a lot more of this work.
So I know that um, Liz Liz does lead you to some of the books that kind of cover ideas about representation, specifically about LGBT inclusion in books. I've also written about that, and I actually have a list of book recommendations on a Queer Endeavors website that I've kind of curated that I should really update, but it's got a lot of great starters. I think that Molly Blackburn's book I'm thinking of Molly Blackburn's book that has a lot of references to why inclusion matters. I think that one of the things that the story that's coming to mind is that Liz and I did we worked together to lead a Title IX book club this year in high school, and it was with students. We were reading research about gender and sexuality, and we read C.J. Pascoe's book, Nice is Not Enough. So this wasn't even fiction, it was nonfiction, it was research, ethnography, and there was a piece in that book, in C.J. Pascoe's book, about students from a GSA leading a drag show. And one of the students in our book club read that and said, I want to do this, right? And I want to take the lessons learned from what happened to the students in the book, and think a little bit about how we can do it a little bit differently. And also, but reading that possibility completely opened their mind, this non-binary student leader's mind, to what they could do in their community. And so they held a fabulous drag show just maybe a month ago that we both got to attend, that was just really wonderful. And I think about the level of possibility that comes from reading books that include identities that are adjacent to your own. It matters so much. And then of course there is wonderful research that shows that it matters to have inclusive curriculum. It matters for your students who don't identify as part of the LGBT community as well, right? That there are ways that it changes and lowers bullying for the school, for everyone, not just the students who identify as LGBT.
And I just want to add to that story, which is such a wonderful example of how, even though our book group was small, what an impact it had, because this drag show, because of the lessons learned from the Nice is Not Enough book, which is a fantastic book that I highly recommend. I also got another idea, the microaggression journals that I talk about data collection in your own school, also came from that, a teacher in that book. but the young people decided they did not want to host the drag show on this district property because they didn't want to be subjected to kind of the restrictions and the kind of negativity that they might be forced to experience by having to go through all the district approvals and protocols. So they hosted it at a public library. And we had like 6 professional queens from Denver, or not just queens, drag performers from Denver. We had probably over 60 or 70 people come. It was this multi-age, wonderful event. People came and learned a drag number and then came, and then the performers did their numbers. It was just such a lovely community event that was created by youth for the community. That was just such a great example of how reading this with young people can really inspire and spark things that adults might never have conceived of.
That's really wonderful image. If no one has any other comments on that, we can move on. We received a question actually before the webinar from one of the participants at the point of registration. This attendee asked, is there research being conducted around how identity groups are merging political efforts? So I'd be curious for anyone's response to that. The particular question pertaining to research, feel free to respond to that, but also more generally about coalition building with different identity groups. I know this is something that is covered in the book a bit, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts and experiences on the topic.
Go ahead, Lee, you unmuted first.
No, it's your party, honey bun. You go.
Well, I will just start by saying that the literature review that I did with some grad students should be coming out in a couple of months, but it's close. But we surveyed 100 articles that have been written since the early 90s on advocacy and activism around LGBTQ equity in schools, and did some really interesting analyses using Kumashiro's anti-oppressive framework, and found that a lot of this advocacy and activism work in schools really focused just on the knowledge piece and not on the action. And so though schools are obviously an important site for education and knowledge, and that is an important element of advocacy and activism, we found that it was very difficult to move from that knowledge level to the action level, or going beyond just sort of band-aid kind of policy solutions to more transformative, restructuring, imaginative solutions. And so that's just sort of like a high level what I was able to take away from that literature review. But when it comes out, I will post it on the companion website and probably blog about it too, so you'll be able to look at it more carefully. But that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to share about kind of the research that I've been engaging with around this topic. But Lee, I'll pass it to you.
Noting the time, I just briefly want to say that there's a way that gender expression human rights protections can actually have a much larger impact and coverage than gender identity human rights protections. There's a lot of similarity between how a trans or gender nonconforming student might be discriminated against because of a school uniform or athletic team uniform policy as a young Muslim woman who veils and who's a hijabi and who might experience that kind of discrimination. And that is an area that I think is really important to look for. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love that Liz started the Beyond the Binary chapter with cis heteropatriarchy, like particularly white cis heteropatriarchy. Because I think there's a lot of coalition potential there. I'm not directly engaging in that coalition building work myself, but I think especially as some of the backlash we've seen in Canada organize, which tends to put racialized people against queer and trans folks for broader interests that aren't actually any of our interests. I think that's really important work to do. There's some modules, if people are interested, there's some modules, some interactive self-advocacy development modules on my resource gg.ca. I just put the link in the chat. If you go to step 4, there's two ways that you can follow a young person in self-advocating with some tools. And one of the hey, that's right, Lee, they, them. And one of the scenarios actually follows a young Muslim woman who's experiencing gender expression discrimination. So I hope that's interesting to folks. And thank you for coming. And oh my God, Liz, I love you.
We are at just about 4 o'clock here. Liz, any final thoughts you want to share before we sign off?
Just I want to thank everybody who was able to be here with us live today. I want to thank in advance anybody who's going to be watching this on recording. I want to just thank my colleagues and friends, Becca and Lee, for sharing their thoughts and their warm words of support for this work. And everybody who's out there doing this work, thank you for showing up every day for the young people and for your community. Take care of yourselves. That's a lot of what Chapter 8 talks about. Rest is resistance. Find and create queer joy, find spaces for freedom dreaming. And because we've got to be in this for the long haul, we know the struggle will continue and we got to stay healthy and strong through it all. So thank you to TC Press for hosting and making this book available. And happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride. Thank you all so much for being here.